Greg is not going to be here today. Hey guys, thanks for showing up. Guys, I'm playing mini Greg again. He apologized many times. I think it's the first time in more than 15 years that he's missed 2 meetings in a row. But he has some kind of family event that he had to travel for, so he couldn't be here today. I don't really have any announcements, although as you guys have seen in the mailing list, there's definitely some things going on about where we need to keep our mailing list. Tux has been around for a long time, but it really hasn't been lately very much maintained. In a sense, the reason for Tux way back was when hosting and getting resources was quite expensive, and a lot of things were donated. So Tux was the idea of getting all that coordinated. Most of those services that Tux provides, if not all, are available for free today. But there's always some discussions about who owns the data, where is it the best place to put it? Should we really put it in the hands of a corporation like Google, or should we try to run it on our own? Teaching moments, people that might not be a great mail admin today can get experiences by running that, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we can make a decision today. I definitely don't want to pretend we can make one without Greg. But please look around, see what are. I think there's a lot of alternatives out there. I think some of you guys are already running groups outside NovaLUG. So let's get an idea of where we could potentially be, or maybe we could stay by having someone fixing whatever issues we have going forward. I don't know if that's the best solution.
Where's the physical infrastructure?
It's a little bit all over the place, and that's part of the problem. But right now, the hosting center I think that we're using is up somewhere in Maryland, just north of DC. But getting in requires special access that only one person has that really is not part of NovaLUG at all. At least that I haven't seen here for a long time. And that's fine in a sense as long as it works. Physical machine, I was there when we plugged in the server, but we never needed to be there since then. And that's the whole idea of computers, right? You do it remotely. So there is remote access to them. But it's a matter of someone dedicating time to maintaining that, keeping them up to date. And when issues like this occurs, let's say there is a mail account on there that's going to awry, should we have mail accounts on there at all other than mailing list? And if there is, who monitors or manages all that? Just standard admin stuff. And there really isn't one, as Greg says, that has taken ownership of that for a long time. So I don't know where we can go. I've got all kinds of ideas, but they all require some kind of admin. So it will be the same problem, right? Even if we go to Google, someone needs to manage the list. But any kind of ideas, we could, discuss that here. See if there's someone that has ideas other than what was on the list, or just fire off. And let's see, maybe. Is anyone here not receiving emails right now from NovaLUG's mailing list?
I cannot sign on to the mailing list.
Cannot sign on?
Yeah, I have. It always comes back says problem. I cannot.
So what? When you say cannot, you get an error, or you never get
error. And
which error?
Greg told me to subject subscribe, body subscribe. So I just did that.
You can, yeah.
Back,
Subscribing is usually a matter of going to a website, putting in your email address, hit subscribe, you get an email saying please confirm. Click here. Once you click there, you're done.
I usually didn't go that far.
If you don't get an email, that usually means that there's something blocking the server from contacting you. And the fun part is that is, right now the running theory is that the reason some people are being blocked is that their emails keeps bouncing. Yes?
I had similar problems. I wasn't getting mail until July 1st. And I found out that part of the reason was spam copy was blocking it. So I went into my mail service just a couple of days ago and whitelisted NovaLUG around spam tag. However, at the same time, I also want to try and go into my account on NovaLUG and I kept getting invalid password.
Right.
I tried to have it send me an automatic copy of my password, and I also get them every month from mail.
Not the password, that's just a reminder you've subscribed. That's what should,
Has the passwords in it also, in clear text.
I haven't seen that, so I get the reminders, but I must admit I get so many I don't get them.
Every month in clear text.
Okay.
The same thing happens for my mailman accounts also.
Okay, well, we can absolutely go in, that's an easy thing for Greg to go
But I
in
got
and
no
check.
mail back, and I said, please send me my password.
Mhm.
I also asked it to unsubscribe, and it refused. I finally just subscribed again using the same credentials, and it accepted it.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, it essentially lost my account or something.
Explain that password on those
Yeah.
Monday.
Getting for friendly.
That's interesting, this is, I never read the
I never read
emails.
them.
So, yeah, and yes,
I got thrown off the list some months ago. And I think it's because of the service that I use is Verizon, it's full of problems. I don't think it's something we can resolve here.
so what Mailman basically will do is it will get bounce messages from whatever ISP you're using to get your email. And once you have bounced, it will then make a queue of all the emails you're not getting once you fix your problem. However, there's as an administrator, you say keep the bounce or keep trying for X number of time. Once that time limit is over, it will cut you off.
I think
Just
that's
basically,
what happened.
so it will initially just hold you and not remove your account and just basically say make you an inactive guy. And after a while, you as an admin you'll be told this account has been removed because it's been I can't contact. And
It's a much bigger problem for me though. I've got to go back to the Verizon.
What looks like happened is that some account out there is throwing out a bunch of emails that are getting bounced back, right? And will get thrown on blacklists. And so certain servers that subscribe to these blacklists won't even take your email anymore, won't even accept it, and that's what's going on. My service provider.
I get people telling me all the time that they can't send anything to that particular address. But I do get stuff.
So that could very well be your ISP that you need to try. And some of them may have a little button on, you will be aggressive on our, filtering for you. And then if you have that clicked, that may take out a lot of spam. But the problem with spam filters has always been that they also mark as spam a lot of the valid stuff. So it again requires admin from your perspective of saying which ones are not spam and which ones are spam. So there's no way it will know which interest you have. So a lot of times what I would do, I don't use the ISP to do those filters myself. I do that on my own. But yes, I've been, some of the NovaLUG mail entered my spam filter too at times, but it's upon me to make sure my filter understand not to do that. Or use this as just whitelist everything coming from NovaLUG. I don't do that, but there's some ownership on your own. One way of getting around that may be trying to get a Yahoo or Google Gmail or something like that, just a mailing list. And a lot of them allows you to forward stuff. So that may be a way of getting around that.
I think I'm going to have to get another.
Yeah. So, but in general, if you don't get a response back, if you go to the website and say subscribe, and you never get that email, there's a very good chance that what you just experienced is what happens, is that never gets. I don't know if all ISPs allow you to see what they rejected. If it actually goes into your junk folder, you can find it there. When I go to a new mailing list anywhere, it usually ends up in my junk folder anyway, the first time. And I'll have to go plug it from there, tell it that it's valid, and then respond to it. So, that's definitely has been common for me always for mailing lists, and I'm on quite a bit. But come up with ideas. I don't know where this is going or where it's going to end. I've been in Google groups, has both good and bad sides to it. I've been on a lot of other lists. Maybe come up with a complete new idea. Maybe you need to use the forums online instead of using emails. I don't know if that's a good idea.
No, that requires, that's too much effort.
Right, it's, email's just simple and works. Well, when it works, but email is probably better, or because you can do it on anything.
Yeah, and the argument counter to that is it only works for the emails as long as I've been subscribed. Like if I'm subscribing and there's a long thread, or there's was a thread a month ago that I was interested in, emails doesn't help me with that. And Mailman's archive is notorious for being pretty bad in searching and all that stuff.
Right, the message board, you can subscribe to the whole thing or to a particular thread.
Yeah. So there's pros and cons on both sides, and I'm not saying we can't make out that decision. Sorry?
No, like you were saying, you can also do it with just keywords as well. So like you said, if there's something that, oh crap, I now have something with a client, or something that comes up, you can do it that way, but you can't do that normally.
I see very common, in particular between mailing lists, there's a lot of repeat questions that has already been answered. And that a lot of times is due to email. Like people either don't have access or didn't take time to check another place before they ask the question. So, anyway, we're really here to listen to Charlie's talk about VirtualBox and partitioning. I think it's going to be, if you're not doing a virtualization, I think this might have some good information. I'm looking forward to it, at least on my side. If there's anyone else having any questions, hopefully all of you know, I do see a couple of new faces. This place is about to be torn down in a few months, so we definitely can't keep meeting here. I just heard from Jason that they have just signed the lease on a new place. So I don't know if we're going to be able to move along with them. That will be in all cases, always make sure. These guys do a pretty good job. I put work. Personally, I like the idea of getting particularly kids involved in doing science and technology stuff. And if it's a matter of building cool robots and needing to know technology and Linux to do that, I think that everyone wins in that one, right? So I really like what they're doing. And when I live closer, I will probably be more able to volunteer time up here to help them out do that. Just the fact that we're getting this space here for free, I think, is something I'm very grateful for. I know Jason's company, like the company I'm from, Red Hat, are always looking for qualified people. So this is another place if you're looking or interested, come talk to us. A good place to find out. So, any announcement from anyone else?
Yes, yeah, just that hardware that I posted on the list, following me out to my car, I'll be at the end of the meeting.
Sure, you brought it with you, huh? Anything else? Yes?
Hi, I made an announcement last month, but I'll just repeat it here real quick. I'm an embedded Linux developer at sort of a defense contractor startup called Azure Summit Technology. For the past few years, I've been maintaining our IT infrastructure, and I don't have the time for it. I got my hands pretty full doing my real job, and we're all Linux-based as far as servers go, and we're looking for somebody who can kind of come in and do some intensive care on our IT infrastructure at our company. Things that I could do, but I just don't have time for it. So if you know anybody, consultants, those kind of folks who might be interested, come see me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Who says this has to get a job in IT? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's my turn.
It is your turn. So, thanks, Johnny.
Very good. All right, guys. I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm preaching to the choir today, and so just to give me an idea of what's going on here, could I have a quick show of hands of who here has never used VirtualBox? Okay. And who here is not comfortable with partitioning a hard drive? Okay. All right. Well, we'll go through it now.
It was 10 years ago.
10 years ago? Well, I don't know that it's changed a whole hell of a lot in 10 years. Most of you obviously have done this before. You probably know more about it than I do. As I go through this presentation, it may well be appropriate for some of you to pipe in here and expand on what I'm presenting to give a better or fuller explanation of some of the ideas. Also, just to give you a little background on how I wound up proposing to give this particular talk. Greg has been asking for some time for people to be willing to give talks, to propose topics, and ask to get on the list. And so I was thinking, okay, what the hell do I know anything about that I could possibly give a talk on? And unfortunately for you, I'm one of the probably least technical in this room from the standpoint of administering Linux systems in any case. And but I had heard through the grapevine that we had some requests for a presentation on how to do partitioning. So I said, okay, Greg, here I could do a presentation on VirtualBox and partitioning. Well, he wasn't all that enthusiastic about the idea. I said, well, look, I'll put the presentation together. You put it on the back burner, and if you're ever desperate for somebody to give a presentation, well, it'll be there ready to go. So here we are today, and you are the lucky audience that gets to participate in this activity.
You would say KVM would have been quicker.
Yeah. Okay, so why am I proposing to combine VirtualBox and partitioning? Well, you guys can read this as well as I can. But the whole idea is that if you're concerned about doing something with computers, especially with the idea of trying to install something new on one of your physical boxes, you don't want to screw it up. VirtualBox is a beautiful environment in which to go run an experiment, try it out, and see what happens. As I hope I'll be able to show you here in a minute, it's trivial almost to set up a virtual computer in VirtualBox. You can then install any number of operating systems or other pieces of software in it. Try out setups that you're not familiar with, that you think may be pushing the limits a little bit. And if it gets screwed up, erase it. And no big deal. It takes very little time. Go back and start over and do it again a different way and see if an alternative approach works that will allow you to get it working. Along those lines, one of the steps that you have to go through to install most Linux operating systems is to partition a hard drive. So this is a perfect environment. VirtualBox is a perfect environment in which to try out partitioning and see if you can get it working the way you want it to. So let's start off with VirtualBox. Where did it come from? VirtualBox was initially produced by a German company, Innotek. It was originally proprietary software. They wanted to sell it to all of us. But they did have a version that was available for free. Then Innotek got bought by Sun. Sun did a very good job of maintaining open source access to VirtualBox for several years, and then Oracle bought Sun. And when that happened, I sort of said to myself, oh shit, that's the end of VirtualBox. But lo and behold, it hasn't happened. Oracle has actually maintained VirtualBox, other than sticking their name on the front of it. I haven't actually seen any effect on VirtualBox. The overall piece of software still works as well as it ever did. Updates keep coming out, and so it's still there, just as good as it ever was. It runs both on Windows, Macs, and Linux. When you get into looking at what it takes in terms of machine requirements to get it to operate, it's a little bit of a fuzzy answer. And the real bottom line here is that the requirements on your machine are not driven by VirtualBox. They're driven by the software that you are going to run in VirtualBox. So if you create a virtual computer that operates on a very thin operating system, you can operate the whole VirtualBox environment with very little resources. On the other hand, if you try to virtualize a device that takes a lot of resources, correspondingly, you're going to take a lot of resources for VirtualBox as well. For disk space, you're going to need as much disk space as would be required to install any operating system on a physical computer, plus a very little bit more for VirtualBox. For RAM, you need however much RAM that operating system would require, the operating system that you're virtualizing, whatever it would require in a physical machine, you're going to need that in VirtualBox, plus a little bit more for VirtualBox. The answer to what are the minimum hardware requirements is a very fuzzy one. But the bottom line is that if you've got a lot of RAM in your computer, you can for sure run it. I've run VirtualBox on a netbook just to see if I could get it to run. It's sort of slow, but it ran.
So we have a comment from one of the people online that he actually had to put in a USB SSD for disk space because he had so many VirtualBox images that his laptop, his MacBook ran out of space. And he's actually been wanting to find for him.
That's not uncommon.
Yeah.
I know plenty of guys that wrote about 30 or 40 VMs on theirs. It's
Yeah, it's about the size that I have on mine too. Not VirtualBox, but yeah. Once you get started, it just keeps exploding.
Now, are you talking about running those simultaneously, or just that you got them all in there?
All in there.
Whenever. Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got something similar, although not nowhere near 40, but you'll see it here in a minute. Okay. So where do you get it? Well, you can go to the VirtualBox website and download it. There are packages available for various Linux distributions. But the easiest way to get it is that a VirtualBox is available in the software repositories for most distros. And that way, if you do download the version from the software repository for your distro, you're far more likely to get a version that will run without problems in your distro. In addition, there are pre-configured virtual computers available online. These are virtual machines that you don't have to create yourself. Now, quite frankly, most Linux distros, all Linux distros that I've ever tried to run in VirtualBox have been easy enough to install that I didn't need to download a pre-configured computer. On the other hand, I have a friend who is an Apple fan, and I tease him constantly about running applesauce computers and having a fruit salad in his computer cases all the time. And so I decided that I would try to virtualize OS X and have that run. He told me I couldn't do it, that Apple wouldn't let that happen, and so that was obviously a challenge that I had to take up. And lo and behold, when I just went out and started following my nose to virtualize an OS X installation, it didn't work. But I was able to go online, search for the peculiar parameters that were required to configure the virtual computer, and within short order was able to get an OS X virtual computer running. It would have been a hell of a lot easier if I had just downloaded a pre-configured virtual computer and installed that in my VirtualBox instance. How do you use it? It's simple enough, and I'm going to actually do it here in a minute. Create a virtual computer. Most of the time, I can just accept the defaults to say that I'm going to run, to identify whichever distro I'm going to run in the virtual computer. In a few cases, I have had trouble getting a 32-bit operating system to run on some of the virtual computers. I found that if I bumped the virtual machine up to a 64-bit machine, it would then allow me to run the 32-bit operating system. It's much easier to actually go through a demonstration than to talk through this stuff, so let me just do that. So here is VirtualBox. When you start it up, this is the screen that you see. Over here on the left is my list of virtual machines that I've played with in the past and haven't bothered to uninstall. Over here on the right is a listing of the parameters that are assigned to the currently selected computer. So if I wanted to say, okay, what's the box that Linux Lite is going to run on? Well, when I highlight it, it shows all of those parameters here. Various controls for VirtualBox are all up here in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. They're very straightforward. You can very much just follow your nose. If I want to get into this computer and change any of this, just click on Settings, and I'll get a dialog box that allows me to go through all the parameters that would be used to define a physical computer, and I can change them as I need to. So let's just set up a virtual computer and see how it works. This is one I set up the other day when I was playing with it. Let's say I did an experiment and I broke it. Well, this is all that's required to get rid of it. Right-click on it, hit Remove. I can choose to remove only the virtual machine but leave its data and hard drive, or I can say delete all files. So I'm just going to get rid of it totally. Okay, if I want to create a new virtual computer, it says New up here. That looks like a good place to start, so let's do it. You can name the computer anything you want to. That is just for people purposes. It's not used by the software in any way. I'm going to install a Linux OS on it. And in fact, what I'm going to do is install a 64-bit version of Linux Mint, which is derived from Ubuntu. So I'll tell them that's what I'm using. Then click Next. And I can define how much RAM I'm going to use in this virtual computer. Yes?
When you selected Ubuntu there, you can tell that it changes the icon, but I've always wondered, does it do anything other than just change the icon that's displayed, or does it?
It does, but I don't know what it does in the background. Okay. But in fact, if you select the wrong icon, sometimes the computer won't boot or won't run.
Yeah.
And that's the only way I know. That's what leads me to say that something is actually going on in the background, but I don't know what it is. Anybody else that knows more about the innards of VirtualBox?
There is something with the processor settings which sometimes gets changed.
It's VTX.
Yeah,
If it doesn't, VirtualBox will check for what's known as VTX, or virtual terminal. And if you do not have pretty much a second or third gen i3 or newer, you will not be able to do 64-bit in the VM or at all. And when you actually do that, if you try to do, say, a 64-bit VM when you don't have VTX or AMDX support, it will actually throw a nice little triangle at the bottom and say, that happened. Same with Mac OS X as well. If you try to run that in 64-bit, especially with Mavericks, it will do the same. Just like if you do any of your network settings or anything like that, and you misconfigure a bridge or something like that, it will flat out say that.
Okay, so the bottom line is, I think this is not just window dressing, it actually does make some change in the way the software operates. Okay, now we can decide how much RAM we want to install, and it's the same thought process that you would go through for figuring out how much RAM to put in a physical computer. So I'm just going to select 2 gigs and keep going. Now, the hard drive. You could decide to run this virtual computer off of a hard drive you had already configured. I mean, it'd be the same thing as if you took a hard drive out of an existing computer and moved it into a new chassis. So that is available. Or you could decide that you're not going to have a hard drive at all. You're just going to run this thing off of a CD that you can boot from. But in general, you would want to create a virtual hard drive. So that's what I'm going to select here. Yes?
I in fact keep a virtual machine available that doesn't have a specific distro associated with it, just so that I can put in the my CD and put it into a virtual environment rather than having to reboot my whole computer.
Okay.
So you just.
So I just keep it already set up. I get to the point that you were just talking about, and then just let it sit there as totally unconfigured. Then when I plug in the CD, I pick it up from that particular machine and boot.
Okay. And you just use that for what? To test out the different CDs, or to, if you wanted to run some application in there that.
No, just to test them out. I get a couple of Linux magazines that always have new distros on their DVDs or in the boxes in the magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So just to play around with occasionally.
Okay. There are a number of different formats or hard disk types available. I don't claim to know what all of these are. I think some of them are hard drive types that will work with VMware or some of the other virtual environments. The particular hard drive format that was created to run with VirtualBox is the first one, and that's what I always pick, but I have no reason to believe that you couldn't pick any of these.
Performance characteristics for choosing one over the other?
Okay, Peter's saying there is, and I don't know the answer. Would you mind answering the question?
So if you go back one swing, fine. So the difference here, when you're looking at, is really how the format of the file that constitutes your hard drive to virtual machine is looking like. Every vendor for virtual machines seems to have their own way of making the overhead of those files differently. And one of those things could be, for instance, can you force the files to be a continuous space in the hard drive, or is it a lot of little segments on the hard drive? Some of them like QCal supports using sparse files. Some of them allows you to do caching or multiple writes at the same time. Some of them are portable easily between different systems, and so on and so on. So there's lots of choices between them. I would, if you're just using one virtualization, always, if you're always using VirtualBox, there's no reason not to choose what Charlie's saying, the one that becomes a VirtualBox. But let's say you're doing VMs that needs to work with someone that uses, let's say, VMware, KVM from our Linux distributions. You may want to pick a format that is compatible with them without compromising what you want to do, or vice versa. You may get an image from them that is a VMDK that you need to import, and here comes the different formats into play.
And QCals are more cloud computing as well.
Yeah. So anyway, there are differences between them. If you're just looking at it from, hey, I'm going to learn, or I'm going to play around and make sure this works, I mean, it's not performance-based, you're not going to see a difference. But if you're looking at something here, I need to run a big database that needs to be performed in a VM, then looking at which of these formats is the best and how you allocate the space on the hard drive comes into play. But we're talking about advanced use, and for normal use, I would just go with whatever virtualization platform you want.
Another question over here.
It's not as much of a question. I will point out that Linux, you're going to be fine, Bill Peter said. and somebody correct me if this is not true anymore, but it used to be the way VirtualBox would model the machine was different than, say, what VMware would model the machine. So if you install Windows or something like that, you have a different driver that can crash.
Only-
It happened with XP at least.
Only when you're doing VBox clones, like if you're actually trying to take like a pre-configured deal, like you're building one for a client,
Right,
and then you're actually cloning that drive to make a visual ISO of it,
okay,
that does sometimes require it to be in a certain format.
okay.
Like if you try to do that for like OSX, like you were talking about, or like cloud instances, like Fedora on the stick or CentOS on the stick,
Right.
those generally will not work as regular VDIs when you clone them without doing all kinds of
Yes. I know we had a
VDI raw,
couple
rawness,
images of an XP machine that we had used for VPN and on network, and it was not portable.
Yeah, the most common ones though are VDI,
Doesn't make any sense.
Kumo, and then QCows. Because Kumo and VDI are pretty much your mainstays, what VMware and VMplayer will use
Right.
and can use. VDI being for VirtualBox and Parallels, and then QCows for anything that's cloud instance.
Right.
Okay, let me try to keep going here. So the next question is, how do I want to determine the size of this hard drive? I could select a fixed size, which means that however many gigabytes I enter is going to be reserved on the hard drive of my host computer. And just a little bit of terminology here. The host computer is the computer on which you're running VirtualBox. The virtual computer runs inside VirtualBox. If I decide that I'm going to have a 300 gigabyte hard drive of fixed size in my virtual computer, that means I've got to have that much space reserved on the hard drive of my host computer. And maybe there's some reason for doing that if you're actually setting up a production environment. But for the kinds of experimenting that I do, I'm much more concerned about not wanting to waste space on my hard drive. I always leave it set to dynamically allocated. That way, even though I say I'm going to have a 30 gigabyte hard drive in my virtual computer, if it only uses 2 gigabytes, that's all that's going to be taken up.
Just for background, how big is the machine that you're actually running right now?
I don't remember for sure, but it's less than 500 gig hard drive, and it does have 8 gigs of RAM. Okay, so for this thing, I'm gonna set it for about 12 gigs. No real ironclad reason why it has to be that way. That's just arbitrarily the way I'm going to do it. If I can figure out how to make it believe that. And I don't want it to
I think VirtualBox tends to do 8 gigs by default. VMware Fusion on the Mac will default to 20 gigs. I'm not sure what other ones do.
Is there any reason to stick with that default sizing? I mean,
Would you have a better reason to go to a different size? Not really.
It
Yeah.
depends on what you want to use your VM.
So-
If you're using a VM just for the OS, and let's say you're making a small web server, maybe not need a big hard drive. But if you're using it for database, you may need a lot of hard disk space. I mean, it depends on your use case.
Yeah. And in fact, the answer to your question, I hadn't even thought about why I was doing it myself. I selected 12 gigabytes because I'm going to use that much space later on in the presentation. So then we could create, and lo and behold, we have a virtual computer. Now, I know from past experience that it's still not exactly the way I want it. For one thing, as it's set up right now, that virtual computer has no idea where to go to find the install files for the operating system that we're going to install, and we're going to have to tell it that. So I'm going to go up here to Settings, and I'm going to start working down a few items in this list. There are quite a few items. You could spend a hell of a lot of time doing all sorts of experimenting and learning here. The other side of that coin is that you don't have to do very much fine tuning here to get a virtual computer that will work just fine. For example, I don't have a floppy drive installed on this thing, so just to get it out of the way, I'll unselect it and drop it down in the boot order. I could turn around and change the base memory, the amount of RAM installed again if I wanted to, but I had no reason to.
But those are not your physical devices, those are your real devices.
These are the parameters of my virtual computer.
So it doesn't matter whether you have a floppy drive in your laptop or not. You can pretend you have one in your virtual machine.
What's under processor and acceleration? There's two more tabs up there.
Okay. Under processor, you can just define how many you want, and there are the choices for acceleration.
So that's the hardware acceleration extensions that are built into modern day chips, everything from your Core 2 Duo on.
You know more about it than I do.
And that option that you just showed there with the acceleration where it said the VTX, if your hard drive, if your host machine does not support it, that will be completely grayed out. You will not have the option for it. So if you see that, and you try to go 64-bit VM, that right there lets you know that you can keep it labeled that way, but if you try to put 64 ISO in there, it ain't gonna happen.
In general, if they're available, you want them.
Yeah.
The only issue is when it comes by default to checkers, they did for a build a while back, and you can't actually get to the acceleration tab to unselect it. I found the best way to recover from that was to actually copy a virtual image of one that works, and which did have it checked, and then replace a hard drive with a different virtual image. Just makes sense.
Okay, the only other thing that I know of that I need to change in here is to tell it where my ISO file is. So I go down to storage, select the empty DVD drive, go over here to this little icon and tell it that I want to choose the virtual disk drive that I'm going to use. And that throws me into a file manager. It works just like any of the file managers that you've used anyplace else, and I've already browsed through to the folder where I keep my ISO files. And I'll just choose the latest version of Linux Mint. So now we have that loaded in the DVD drive. I click OK, and it's ready to be booted up. So I click Start, and the virtual computer will start booting. It boots fairly quickly. I don't know, and I've heard some people say that one of the things they like about virtual computers is how much faster it boots than their physical hardware. I actually don't see that in the installations that I have. I don't know whether I'm doing something wrong or if it just happens.
Are you talking about while you're installing it, or are you talking about once you have installed it and starting it?
I'm talking about once I've installed it, even. I mean, yeah, right now we're booting off of a virtual DVD, so it's a little bit slower perhaps than it would be if it was booting off a hard drive.
Oh, hard drive, yes, but also DVD, an actual physical DVD, this is much faster than a physical DVD. Yeah.
Okay, so here I have a virtual computer. I've booted into my live DVD, and you see exactly the same screens that you would if you were working on a physical computer. And I could select to install the hardware if I wanted to, and then go through the rest of the process. You go through exactly the same steps as you would with a physical computer. At the end, it will ask you whether you want to continue playing with the live DVD or if you'd like to reboot and run off the hard drive. And you can make that selection to reboot if you want to. In fact, if you choose to reboot, it automatically removes the ISO from the virtual DVD drive, so that when it does reboot, it will come up boot off of the hard drive instead of the DVD. So at this point, I'm just going to kill this machine and move on into a different part of the presentation. Are there any questions?
Back when you were selecting the optical drive, is there any benefit of putting it off on the SATA controller instead of the ATA controller?
I don't know, I've never tried that. Have you ever
I've been doing it
that?
that way, but with no real testing.
Yeah, I've never tried it. And for whatever reason, I have succeeded in freezing this thing. Okay. All right, let's go back to partitioning at this point. And so what is a partition? A partition is just a subdivision of a physical hard drive to create one or more virtual hard drives. And we'll go into why you might want to do that a little bit later. But that's basically what I view a partition to be anyway. If anybody has a better definition, speak up. Otherwise, we'll keep going. There are three types of partitions. A primary partition is the one that you normally would want to play with. However, you can only have 4 primary partitions on any hard drive. Yeah, you do.
Only major exception to that is actually using GPT, which is also what Macs use, which allows you to actually have all primaries, 128 partitions to the size of 2 terabytes each.
Okay.
It's also the same way I run my system with LVM on the GPTs, which is the same way that Macs run. But the only other way around that without doing GPT, which does not play well with some of the older systems, is to use this extended partition beyond that first one. So running your boot partition as partition 1, and then running everything else in the extended as partition 2.
Okay, well then I will add a caveat to this presentation. That it does not apply to Apple computers because I don't know anything about them.
What you're basically doing is talking about the old DOS partitioning. And that's what most devices are, because that's been around forever. That's very understood support in the device. But it has a lot of limitations in today's world. So that's why there's a lot of other partitioning table layouts available today. And the one we're just talking about is where things are going. For very large devices, that's what.
So we'd expect to see that in the Linux and Windows.
Actually, that is the default today in any new machine you're working on. Because
the newest Windows stuff, it's basically required if you have a drive that's over 2 terabytes in size.
Yeah. But, and if you want to do EFI building and all kinds of other cool little stuff for security. Yeah. So, but I think from this perspective, right, if you have a small box, I would always choose what you're doing.
Okay. Well, I didn't know I was doing a presentation on the history of partitioning, but it looks like that's what I'm doing. Anyway, as Peter said, if you're working on a simple small box, you might find the type of environment I'm talking about. You have a maximum of 4 primary partitions. If you need more partitions than that, what do? Well, the way that you used to do it is you would limit the number of primary partitions that you define to less than 4 and create an extended partition. An extended partition is basically just a container for logical partitions. That comes to the third type of partition. The logical partition acts like a primary partition, but you can have more than 4 of them, and you put them in an extended partition.
What's the distinction between a primary and an extended? How does the machine treat those differently?
You don't you don't load software into an extended partition. You load other partitions into an extended partition.
Primaries are always
Yes, because the difference is the when your computer boots, the actual boot sector right on the hard drive is so small that it really doesn't have the capacity to understand very complex formats. So it only understands primary partitions when it's an old-fashioned DOS group. And it doesn't read the whole table, it can only read primary. So all it can see, usually gets to from sector 1. It's sector 1, track 1. Everything is there.
I'm sorry. I was saying it's small enough because it used to be that they would actually look at a CD. If you're looking for a CD, it would actually look like you're looking at an old floppy, and that's all it stays there.
It's an extreme small. The whole idea is to make it so small that computers back in the days could boot, and actually you can have a very small piece of code to boot the computer. Now that worked great when we didn't have that much space that we didn't deal with, and as you probably have realized, we have terabytes of hard drives today, and that whole idea went away. I mean, my BIOS has more capacity today than my computers used to have back in the late 80s, early 90s.
The reason I ask is because I'm running a Raspberry Pi, and the boot partition is a FAT32. This is Raspbian.
But so that has nothing to do with the partition table.
Well, the point is, it comes up, and I'm just following the instructions. In the boot partition, it turns out there's a FAT32 partition, and then all of the rest of the chip is formatted in an ext4. Okay. If I just pull the plug on the Raspberry Pi to shut it off, when I boot it up, it boots up fine. But when I do dmessage, it complains. It says the FAT32 partition flunked, and I'm supposed to run FSCK on it, which I can do by unmounting it and then running it and fixing it. But it doesn't seem to break anything, that it's corrupted.
It does that, but FAT32 is not considered a bootable full file system. If you were to do it in X2, you would not have the errors, but to run a Raspberry Pi or any operating system with boot partition, even with LVM, unless you're strictly going all Linux or all Mac, that 32 is the way to go for any of your boot partitions. Same way if you're actually transferring stuff on a USB stick from multiple machines or multiple operating systems. FAT32 is read by everybody. NTFS, Mac will not read without a whole bunch of drivers.
It will read it, but it won't write it.
Correct. You can't do the text to it, and it will complain even at reading. Whereas Linux will read and or write to NTFS, albeit at a degraded value compared to X3, X4, ZFS, HFS, any of that. But in order for it to have compatibility with everything, it runs in FAT32. On a Raspberry Pi, you can run the boot partition as X2, but the support for it is currently.
Well, this is straight default stuff.
Yeah, I think I can explain why you see the message and why it doesn't seem to hurt anything. But maybe we can talk about it after the presentation.
I don't want to interfere.
That's all right. Okay. So once you understand that you can create a number of different partitions, the question is how many do you want and what are you going to use them for? There are a number of different partitioning schemes. I'm going to talk about just a few and try to talk about why you might want to do it. The simplest partitioning scheme in Linux is to have a root partition and a swap partition. The swap partition is a trick to extend RAM. If you are trying to run or keep several different applications open simultaneously in RAM, and the amount of space needed for those applications exceeds the actual physical RAM in your machine, your operating system will take the inactive or minimized applications, relocate them into swap, and use the actual physical RAM just to run the applications that are open at any given time. So you always need a swap partition. Quite frankly, I'll stick my neck out and you guys can correct me again. If the current machines where you can easily put a hell of a lot of RAM in them, it's not clear to me that I ever use up all of my physical RAM. And I could practically, I think I could probably have no swap drive or no swap partitions in many of my installations, and it would run just fine. Anybody
Try to
have?
hibernate your laptop.
Yeah, hibernation.
And what happens when you hibernate?
That's a memory that's written to the swap file.
I see.
So it needs to be the size of the RAM.
But for the VMs,
That's
you
not
can,
true anymore either, though. There's compression involved.
You can do ZRAM, but I just put it.
Fair enough, but yeah, there is compression involved in like.
but I mean, you're talking about VMs, and that, you know, do you hibernate the VMs that way?
Okay, so sounds like you better have a swap drive or a swap partition. And when you get to talking about the size of it, this is where you can also get into a nice discussion. My understanding is that it needs to be the size of your RAM, just a little bit bigger. If you will,
Normally it's 1.5 to 2.
but you will find people who tell you it needs to be 1.5 to 2 times the size of your RAM.
If you have a little bit of RAM, that's true. But if you get an 8 gig, 12 gig machine, don't make a 24 gig. No.
Okay.
Everything is relative, unfortunately, but for your VMs, yeah, mine usually, I'll just keep it the same as my RAM, or I have the exact same observation as you do. My VMs rarely use swap, so I make them as small as possible.
Okay, so the swap is an extension of the RAM. The boot partition in this partitioning scheme holds everything else. So you size that for the rest of your hard drive. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Why do I want to do this? I mean, like I'm thinking that the OS by default sort of handles this automatically when you go through the wizard. And I'm just wondering, is there a reason why I want to custom configure partitions?
And we're going to get into that as I go through the other partitioning schemes.
Yeah.
But as you say, this is quite often the default partitioning scheme that the installer will set up. And you wind up having to have a swap partition because the operating system expects one to be there, and you have to have a root partition because that's what all the rest of your hard drive, all the rest of your software is in. Okay, let's go on to the next partitioning
To me, the
scheme.
only primary advantage of that particular scheme is that you don't run out of any space on any partition until you run out of total disk space.
That's right. In fact, you guys probably have run into this. Back in the old days, in fact, I haven't actually bought a computer that I didn't build myself in so long. Maybe they're still doing it, but you'd buy a computer and it would come with the hard drive partition already. And there would be one partition that would be set up to be the C drive, and that's where you would install your operating system. And the manufacturer would have used this other partition to install a backup of the operating system software and all of the crapware that they wanted to ascend along with the computer. And basically, it just wasted a huge amount of space on your hard drive. In that environment, generally what I would do is delete that second partition and then expand the one that I was actually installing it in so that I could use the whole capacity of my hard drive.
One comment online that says if you're using TempFS, swap is required.
Say that again.
If you're using something called TempFS, which is like a RAM drive from the temporary files,
Right.
swap is required.
Okay.
So that's just a comment online. I just want to pass it on.
Okay, I think probably the next most common partitioning scheme, and perhaps the most common for just normal laptop computers, are to have a root, home, and a swap. The swap partition serves the same purpose as we've discussed before. It's sized the same way as we've discussed before. The root partition is where your operating system and all of your applications would be installed. and you could size that as a minimum of 4 or 5 gigabytes, but quite often you need as much as 8 or 10 gigabytes, especially if doing an upgrade to your operating system requires that partition to hold both the previous operating system and the new operating system simultaneously. The home drive would just be where the user's data and configuration files are located. And the reason for doing this type of partitioning scheme is when you do a clean and reinstall of your operating system, you can set it up so that it will install the new operating system into the root drive, and you can tell it to leave the home drive alone. So your user data and your configuration files will be kept maintained and will still be usable for the new install. Anybody got any?
Is that the way that the recovery thing works? Like if you have to recover your operating system, it just replaces the operating system rather than screwing around with your user data?
If you tell it not to reformat when you're doing a full install, yes, then it won't touch it. But if you run your installer in default mode, whatever partitions you tell it about, it will format. So you've got to be very careful how you do a recovery install if you already have data you don't want to change. But in essence, if you just make sure it doesn't reformat it, it will preserve it.
Okay, there are several other partitioning schemes. In fact, there are undoubtedly partitioning schemes that I've never heard about. And quite frankly, I don't really understand totally why you would want to use this partitioning scheme. But as I understand it, there are, if you had a separate partition for your log files and your computer ran into a problem and the log files started growing extensively, this one would keep the log files from impinging on the operation of the operating system because it's isolated in its own partition. And similarly for the temporary files. And this is a place where I know some of you other guys have a better idea of how it works and why than I do. So please jump in.
Go ahead.
There was a time where you had to have separate partitions like that because you had separate physical disks, because the disks were so very small that you wanted a separate root on an actual separate, a separate bar on its own separate spindle.
Or this is a great way of securing it. You could, if you took all the files that would change out of the root position, so it was just the binaries that was compiled, you could mount the read-only. So there was no way of changing the binaries that your OS was. All the writable files were in separate partitions, had nothing to do with the OS.
User monitoring is not usually a good idea anymore.
Yeah, users typically fold it in.
Yeah, you have to, because the links have been and been involved in links together, stuff like that. VAR is generally a good idea because if your log files fill up, then you don't want to get locked out of the system, you know, it's not.
That, or if you've got someone who's trying to help you specifically, and something does, like Peter was saying, go wrong with your root partition, you can literally just yank a full copy of your VAR and just let them go ahead and have full reign of your entire log files, figure out exactly what's wrong, so that when they tell you to go in and do whatever, they already have a full, 30,000 foot view of exactly what all went down. So they're doing less of, oh crap, stop right there, don't do anything else, we need to backtrack to do this. They can do a systematic deal, and or if they're running a repair script or something like SuperGrub, they can actually run it a lot easier, knowing exactly what needs to be done in one order.
Okay, so is it correct to say that you would set up a partitioning scheme like this one, or maybe even like the next one, for a server in a production environment You would never do this with a desktop. You just use the root home and swap partitioning scheme and leave it at that.
Sans user, I put home with different partitions.
So there's a lot of what you have up there, as was said, came from the need of, I need a lot more space that can be on a hard drive, a single hard drive. So this is one way of dealing with it. You would, in today's modern OSs, there's a lot of those that cannot really be separated and have a functioning OS. The cool thing is that if you do have root by itself, and let's say you have var on another one, you can in theory lock down var and take it out of your system, fix the file system while the OS is still running, and put it back. All you need to do is stop all the things and start writing to the volume. So stop your mail server, stop your anything, stop syslock, and then you can actually unmount var, fix the file system, and mount it again. But you can't do that with user. It used to be the case, but you can't do that.
Okay, so that all of this discussion is applicable to servers, not to desktop.
No, you
Why wouldn't I
still do it, and furthermore though, you can take it one further, you don't normally do the partitioning at all anyway, you give yourself a partition and you use the volume manager, you use the file system that has the volume manager, right? I mean, just because, you talked about it earlier, stretching partitions and things like this, it's much easier to do with the volume manager, snapshots, that's what you copy on the right row.
So as my workstation, I may have, if I'm a developer, I may have a database running. I may have some stuff that writes a lot to the hard drive. So I will still have some of those same problems as a workstation. That said, there's all kinds of reasons for putting some of those in a separate partition. May not have anything but hard drive. It could be, as we talked about, there's some guys keep telling me online here done that there are file systems that are all in memory. And the reason for doing that is so when you boot, you get a clean start every time. So for instance, your temporary file system, why preserve that between boots? So that might be the reason for quote-unquote partitioning the system, just so you can get that kind of functionality. And I'll certainly do that on workstation. That would be valid to do on workstation as well as a server.
Okay, but I think it would be, well, I know it's true to say that I have never gotten into a situation personally where I needed to go to this kind of a partitioning scheme. John?
Just to show how far you can go afield with this, I'm still affected by things that happened 20 years ago with my school directory. At that time it was under user, and either print jobs or floods of mail or something like that would fill up the school directory, and since it was under user, it would bring down the system. Now it's under var, it might still bring down the system, but it's still something that scares me. I even put a small school partition, but I don't think I've ever had any problems with it ever since those long ago days.
Okay.
There really is no hard and fast rule. You're going to have to look at what you're going to be doing with the system and find out what's going to be best to lay things out. I have to, for all of my customers, I have to set up a separate user local partition because they're installing their own separate data there, and I can't have that. I can't have that as part of root partition. So really, it's just going to be you have to know ahead of time what you're going to be really using the system for, and that will help you determine how you're going to lay it out.
For security reasons, you're separating things, right? So you put things in separate buckets.
Yeah. Okay, does this lead anybody else to have any questions about this? All right. I'm building up here to another demonstration. So just to talk about how to partition. The first thing, you've got to unmount any drive that you're going to repartition. You obviously don't want to edit the partitions on the hard drive that you're operating from, or you're going to wind up finding that you have to do an install on the whole thing. If you were doing a partitioning other than in an install, you can use gparted or other partitioning tools. Almost all installers, in fact, maybe all installers, actually have partitioning tools built into them that work very similar to the way gparted works. The general steps in doing a partitioning unmount the drive if it's mounted, create a new partitioning table that will clear out any old partition table that exists. And the result of this is if there is any data on the drive, when you create a new partition table, it will make that data inaccessible. Then you select the free space on the drive, indicate that you want to add a new partition, specify the parameters for the partition, and that is what you need to define a partition. If you want to have additional partitions in on that drive, you repeat the 3 steps above until you've created the additional partitions you want to. This will maybe all make more sense when we actually get into a demonstration here in just a second. But in any case, when you work through those first 6 steps, you have essentially written a script for a partitioning operation that's going to go on. And at the end of the whole thing, you tell your partitioning software to actually apply those steps, and that's when the partitioning actually takes place. Yes,
I would add one more step to that.
Okay.
Running a command called part probe.
What is it?
Part probe. It's basically partition probe.
Okay.
Because the OS may not see that you have done new partitions. And part probe it tells it to go out and scan for the changes you've done, so it will reflect that in the OS that you have new partitions.
And is that a command line? Okay, so if, now if you're doing install and you're going through the partitioning steps as part of the installation,
You fire up the terminal itself and run.
If you're doing it part of the install, it will do it for you. If you're following the GUI that is an installer, but I thought you were talking about using a gedit or gpartedit. In that case, once I'm done with that, I would do a part code. So before I can use the partitions to format them and all that, they have to be visible in the OS. And part code will allow me to do that.
I thought they would be formatted as part of the operations in gparted.
You
Again,
can
if you add it or you move anything on them, it's not a guarantee that when it rescans in the installer, that it may or may not see it. Also, like if you add like a terabyte external for like a backup drive, after you started the installer, it by default will not normally recognize it. And that saves you having to also reboot the whole system.
Yeah, that's the alternative.
It does it right there. It's like running case splice will allow you to reset stuff for when you're doing kernel upgrades and stuff like that without having to reboot on the server.
Okay. Well, my wife told me that I learned more in this presentation than the audience would, so I think that's probably true. So let's actually try to do a partitioning demonstration here. I'm going to go back into VirtualBox. I'm going to go back down to this demo that we started out before. I'm going to see if I can reboot it. See if it will start up here. It looks like it's going to do it. And so this, we took this before up to the point where the live DVD had booted, and we had the install icon on the desktop. So I'm just going to let it return to that point and then pick up the installation process and actually go through the installation through the point of partitioning in any case. Okay, so here's our desktop. I'm going to tell it to install Linux Mint 17. All right. I'm just going to select the defaults for everything that I can. And tell it that I want to create and resize partitions myself. And that puts me into the partitioning utility. Now, I don't know whether this is, whether gparted is running in the background behind this thing, or if this is a...
In Mint, it does.
Say that again?
In Mint, which is also what I use. That does run gpart10 as its backend.
Okay. And so the steps that you go through are pretty much just the way I described them earlier. Tell it that you want a new partition table. It tells you that you're going to remove all the partitions, and as the process of doing that, you would lose any data that's already on the hard drive. So we say continue. It's now indicated that I've got 12.8 gigabytes of free space. I'd select the free space and click this add sign to indicate that I want to add a partition. The first partition I'm going to put on this is the root partition, and I want to make it big enough to hold the operating system and all my applications, and leave the rest for the home partition and swap. So I'm just going to make it 8 gig.
Technically, that's not very good.
What was that?
64, you might want to make that a minimum of 9. Because normally it screens for 8.6 on a 64-bit.
All right.
Might be slightly different in the VM, but on real hardware, it screens for 8.6 minimum.
So I can define any of a number of different operating systems that, file systems that I want to put on it. I'll just use ext4. And I'm going to define that this is my root partition. And so that is now added to the list of partitions, and my free space has reduced. But now I'll go back and add the home partition. Since I limited the size of the hard drive in this virtual machine, it's not going to leave much left over for the home partition. I want to leave enough for a little bit more than 2 gigs for the swap partition. That means maybe 1.5 gigs for the root partition here.
Why not create your swap
I mean,
first?
for the home partition. What?
Why not create your swap first so you can make sure you get the space you want for that? And then,
Okay, now I had read that the people argued that the swap partition ought to be at the end of the drive. And so that's why I'm doing it in the order that I did.
if you do, that's sort of fine. Now you're not on a physical hard drive right now, so that doesn't matter too much. But a physical hard drive, the last power hard drive is a lot slower than the first one. So if you want a fast OS, you certainly don't want the most important file that pretends to be RAM to be the slowest of everything.
So would you install that before the root partition, or
I
just
would,
right after?
yes, I would do it before root, but after root.
Okay.
So if you're using an LVM or something like this, it would be root or home, root, swap, and then anything else, or root, home, swap. That way that they're both as close to the closest section of the drive. Because just like if you spin a top or something on a string, it spins faster when it's close to your finger or the tether or anything like that. As it gets out further and that string goes out, it obviously will take longer for those revolutions. And in the same vein, unless you're using an SSD, the longer it takes, the longer it's going to take for you to actually recover anything in your home partition or anything that's on the furthest extent of that hard drive.
But remember, you're virtualized, it doesn't matter.
Okay, but let's just start over then. So what should I create first, swap or root?
I would, well,
I'm
you're not
going to put the grub in master boot record. So
yes, but grub needs, you're using your root as your root drive. So I'll put that first, because if it's not first, for a normal fixed situation, some older BIOSes will not be able to get to it.
okay, so we're going to have root, and we're going to make that 9 gig. And left the ext4 as the file system.
And I will add your swap and then your home.
Okay. Say a new partition. Define that as being.
You'll actually
use as, that's what we want.
Okay. And I only need a little bit more than 2K here. And then I'll take the rest of my free space and make that my home partition.
The only time that boot really becomes an issue is if you're running either multiple operating systems on the same drive in a multi-boot or dual boot, or if you're running either crypto or an LVM or a combination thereof. Because the boot partition in that case cannot be in a Linux only format if you're running multiple systems, unless they are all Linux. Or if you're running LVMs, most of the grub without tinkering with it cannot read inside of an LVM by default. And that requires a lot of tinkering with it, which even myself, I don't recommend for anyone unless they're really good at it.
You and a VM, you're doing very dedicated just for that machine. So a lot of these ifs and buts are really not applicable to that environment. It's when you have dual boots, when you have multiple OSs using the same storage, and there's a lot more at play and a lot more you have to think about where you put things. But in a VM, you saw it, the world is your oyster. You can try anything you want. That VM is the only thing that's going to access.
Is there any way in the VM, just out of curiosity, if you're doing a partition like this for swap space, to guarantee that it's contiguous on the VDI or whatever the file is that they're using for the hard drive?
That depends on the file type you're using. But within here, you can't tell.
Yeah.
Not by default.
I'm just trying to think of effectively what speed would affect, in the end. You would want it to be.
The Q cow, you can basically, when you create it, you can say, make sure this is contiguous.
Right.
So when you have that, your file is contiguous, then this will be contiguous.
Okay, so now I've defined the three partitions. I can designate over here, well, sometimes, and I guess in this case, maybe because it's a clean initial install, it doesn't give me the opportunity, but I can sometimes tell it that I don't want to partition my home, that I don't want it to format my home partition. Any of you know why I can't?
You have no partition table. You just create. There is nothing there.
Yeah, okay, all right. So if there already was a home partition, then I could unselect. And so if I was doing a reinstall, that would be the way that I would protect the data that's already in the home partition.
Correct. It would just remount it, but it would not actually do anything to the actual contents of it outside of giving it a new mailing address, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so at this point, I can click Install Now. The first thing it will do is go through and actually create those partitions, and then it goes through the rest of the install, which I don't propose to do here because there's not really anything, it's out of the scope of the presentation. And that, in a nutshell, shows a demonstration of how to do partitioning. I'm curious, for the folks who hadn't done partitioning before, didn't feel comfortable with it, does that help any? Did we go too fast, skip over steps that are necessary? Any questions?
Do you have to have a partition table on a disk?
Are you asking me that because you think I know or because you want to tell me?
I'm posing it because others may benefit from it.
Please tell.
You don't really have to have one. As a matter of fact, I do a lot of work with Sands and Luntz, and often my customers, because I work for a cloud service company, that we end up having to deal with file systems. They constantly have to buy more space and grow. So generally what we do is a lot of times we're growing past that 2 terabyte limit as well. So we make sure that we don't put a partition table down at all. And it works fine, because then if the storage, they can grow the LUG, then I do it all with LVM. So I do, resize, and can do it all on the fly and keep the host up while it's happening.
You need it for booting, but other than for booting, you don't need it. Because the BIOS is very dumb.
Well, please just attach the external disk without having to boot it.
I'm sorry?
Can you attach the external disk without a partition cable so that
Yeah, any additional, so if you have more than one disk, only the one that you boot on has to have something the BIOS understands, which is a
You can
partition
actually
table.
boot it directly from the USB stick and not have a partition table on the physical drive.
Yeah, but it will be on the USB stick.
Correct. You would have to have that in order to actually boot. Otherwise, tough goods. We're not getting into it.
And if anybody's found a way in VirtualBox to add another disk without rebooting, I'd certainly let me know.
I do that all the time.
You still have to restart the VM.
Yeah.
For iSCSI?
Well,
the VM's running.
even if you're doing iSCSI stuff, do it in expansion pack. You can do it as a USB, but you can't do it as an actual iSCSI at all.
If you attach to an iSCSI initiator, you can't tell it to just scan that?
If it's a live running one, if that's the case,
Well, then it's just an OS with a network-based storage. It should act like any other OS with a
the
network-based
VM
storage.
itself is actually being the initiator, not VirtualBox.
Yeah, but then you have no iSCSI if it's the virtual hypervisor.
that makes sense. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. John?
Yeah, back when you were still working on the image, the ISO file, where you hit the install button, one of the things that you could have done at that point was to go into Gpart edit of the ISO and then format the disk there with Gpart edit if you weren't comfortable with whatever formatter the install procedure needs to be.
Right.
So you could have actually gone into the install script with your format already set up.
And then just get, in this case, a Debian or Ubuntu based system, and just go into something else for your deal, which is also the same way if you were to multi-boot. You can just do the same thing, and then just mount your points as you do normally, and then worst case reformat them if you chose to do so, or not in case of all, if you had a pre-existing system.
Okay.
Got some questions online if you're willing to take
Sure.
this. So you had a slide where you had all the partitions on there, and one of them was called SRV. Some guys asking, what is SRV? Been watching that partitions, never heard of it before?
And I don't know the answer to that. Would anybody like to help me out?
Normally that's for server files. Again, like we were saying, that's, you keep your actual server logs there, and your actual machine logs normally in var. Same with the opt. If you are doing a lot of optional software or stuff that's not necessarily going through your repositories, i.e. doing Chrome or say a lot of guys do Minecraft and stuff like that nowadays, the install scripts, the only way to get them to go is doing it through a shell installer or a .run file. And normally those will not default to user binning or user sbin or sbin, so they need somewhere to dump, and that would be either in opt or for server side stuff, you dump it in server or SVR. That way it has its own little section as well. And it's more like they were saying before, where you have to have everything pretty much partition set up, this thing for so dang small. Or for the security standpoint, because any of those partitions, you can actually change the ownership of them as well, and or change your read-write permissions. So you can make your var partition as its own separate VM, only accessible to someone in the admin group, so only your IT department can actually mess with it. Now you can do it like chmod 644, so everyone can read it, but they can't actually mess with it. So like if the IT guy is SSHing into it or something like that, he can have the guy go ahead and open the file and read the file or whatever, and then you just take like a screen capture of it. But he can't actually read write or that. So like if he's doing something stupid,
he's not able to go ahead and try to change things or change timestamps or anything like that. But that also leaves that in a separate partition as well, so that, like on an IT aspect, you can go ahead and just back up your var logs every other day or whatnot, and keep a copy of those, or any installs when you're doing it, and keep that separate in the system, which for most normal home users is a little bit more than anything ever needed. But at the same time, it's something that if you're doing a lot of stuff, or you're doing a lot of developer stuff, those are when you start getting into stuff like that. Like myself, I have an ops file, user file, var, temp, and then the root swap home myself.
Okay.
There's a follow-up to that answer. The question is, so SRV is a data partition like var and home?
It would be, but it's not used in the same way.
The follow-up goes, so SRV is a data partition much like var or home. That's the comment.
From a file system standpoint, yes, but it's not used as a data partition itself. Not like an NFS or NFS share or anything like that.
And they're on Solaris boxes, I think, by default.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I've seen that Solaris
it's
on
the same file system, the file system, right?
Oh, but he's asking what it's used for.
Yeah, it is. I mean, just kind of piggyback on what you said with opt and with, so there's no hard and fast rule what you put where, in the Solaris world, like all this stuff, like for example, Adria, if you have clear case and stuff like that, we'll go down that tree. We tend to do opt tools is a shared amount across all of, our Solaris boxes in any particular subnet. He was saying earlier he uses user local for that for similar stuff, so people can mount
That way you've got a separate section for like each
But,
local.
in the Linux world, generally, like if you pull down software and you make configure or configure make install and drop, if you don't change the prefix, it drops to the user local. In the Solaris world, if you're actually lucky enough to find something that was written for Solaris and aren't going to spend 2 weeks trying to get to the file, then you change the prefix to like opt, something like that, just because that's the kind of de facto standard in that world. But there's no hard and fast rule to what you do there.
Many years ago, there was a lot of software that you installed from vendors that wanted to install an opt,
Right.
and you wanted to have a separate opt just again for that segregation. But again, there really is no hard and fast rule. Set it up any way you wanted. Just that there were times in the past that we had to set up separate because of the fact that we had 100, 200 megabyte disks that we had to work with. So you had, and I had to set up systems where I had to deal with, as many physical devices that I could put in a single SCSI chain just to be able to get the disk laid out the way I wanted to. So, but those days are gone, thankfully.
Okay, do we have more questions on that?
Yeah, let's take one in here first.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is the license fee of VirtualBox and how much is that?
VirtualBox itself does not actually have a fee.
I think if you play with as a hobbyist, that's what I was told. If you play as a hobbyist, you owe up. But if you try to grow or use for profit or something, you have to do nothing.
That's VMware Player. I don't know.
VM Player and VM Workstation, yes. And those price tags for VM Workstation, you're looking the better part of about 2 Gs for Workstation.
2K.
Okay. Oh, that's the VM.
For VM Workstation and VM Player, I believe default just play around is 250, but the VM Workstation, which is like the, holy grail of everything when it comes to the VM side of things, that's like 2,000.
So VirtualBox is free.
Correct.
So all the VM will survive if VirtualBox is there.
They're doing different optimizations.
Correct. I mean, honestly, if you're doing like a bunch of gaming or something, you really need a bunch of graphics on.
So can I read it? I mean, I looked up the answer to this online. So it basically says here, the base packages that everything but the extension packs is released under TPL. Essentially, that means you have full source, full access to the full source of VirtualBox, and you can distribute and modify provided you ship modifications on the TPL. If you want to use the extra features in the extension pack, you can use them free of charge for personal use or evaluation purposes. Both packages, VirtualBox Base and VirtualBox Extension Pack, are available on the download. So it basically says if you want to use those additional features, which it seems to be a better mission-critical use, I guess, they require a license, but I'm fairly sure you're not using those.
I have no idea what the licensing fee is.
It only basically goes to a remote desktop feature, basically. So you start up with a remote desktop by VNC, automatically have the control console without having to install a VNC protocol. So it allows you to have a little bit more flexibility. They don't have to have complete headphone systems or headless systems. You basically have to mix a headless system unless you need.
Okay, do we have more questions?
Yeah, one more comment in here. It's more like a thing, a comment than a question. He says, to reduce what has to be backed up as an image, you push the swap on a separate spindle in the virtual machines. Then it only backs up the full image, and it doesn't have to back up all the swap stuff. So he basically adds 2 hard drives to every VM. One where he keeps all the swap stuff, and then he has another one where he has all the data, and when he backs up that whole image.
That actually is also very nice if you're actually remastering images as well for like Google ISOs after you're doing that. So like you've got problems with drivers and shit like that. You can actually do that and then literally only copy your actual live system without the swap. So when the installer actually runs, it creates all of what that actual native machine has, or what it's actually set up on that machine. So it doesn't inherit what it was built on. So say if you're on one of ours that may only have 4 or 8 gigs worth of RAM, but you've got this dude you're setting it up for that's got, server from hell with like 64 gigs of RAM, it'll go ahead and adjust it accordingly if you don't have the RAM or the swap already built into the actual call. But all the other stuff will be there as it would any other install CD, but it's ready to rock and roll out of the box.
That's it, fun.
That's it? Okay, and John?
Yeah, this is not covered in your talk, so maybe somebody else has an answer for it. I recall there's a package called, I think, Guestfish, that allows you to take your virtual machine's disk file and mount it and see the virtual files in that single file. I've not been successful at doing it. I'm wondering, does it matter what type of initial file type you use, VDI, which is what I generally choose, or some of the other ones? It has work better with Guestfish or anything else?
I've used it with QEMU, KVM quite a bit. I have not used it with the particular VirtualBox format, but anything that QEMU understands, like BMDK, it will understand that format and read it in. So if it's raw or QCOW or those, it will read them.
I've actually been another bizarre conversion for my headset. Originally they were Zen virtual machines. I then use the QEMU INC to convert to what VirtualBox could deal with. So I need device drivers to move it back to VMware. And it worked flawlessly, which is very neat.
Yeah, you can use the converter to make the format of that file into something it understands, and then you can mount it. But that sort of defeats the purpose of a quick access if you have a large VM. Because you will have to convert the file to get it into a format. But I'm sure there might be similar features on the VirtualBox side. It may be part of that extension package.
Actually, it's part of the
okay.
Okay, now I have a question. now that you guys have explained that this is really a history of partitioning, where do I go to learn how the new wave is going to do it?
Find a new way.
I was going to say, you use the word the new way. There is no the. There's several.
I'm a big fan of whatever, just even if you're using another district, might have to filter out some of the information. The best wiki, in my opinion, I'm biased, I use it, but is ArchWiki. ArchWiki is by far the most well documented and most up to date. You don't search through message boards and such, that sort of thing. But GoogleWiki.archwiki.org. that's what it is.
ArchWiki, regardless of what distribution you're on, is a very, very solid resource.
Okay.
That and Red Hats, both of them have some really, really solid documentation.
Serverfault.com is usually pretty good, and I'll release, at least you get people.
All the Stack Overflow sites, yeah.
Yes, that, yeah, any of those.
But that's more of a question answer thing.
Yeah, but they come up with it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening. You guys have been an extremely good audience.
Thanks, Charlie.
Before we take off, don't think, is Miles Oliver still here?
I am here.
I need to talk to you afterwards.
Yes.